Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I'm sure others will be watching the recording. Welcome to the AgTech Thought Leaders webinar. A little bit of a housekeeping before I introduce our speaker, our thought leader for this session. Our guest AgTech thought leader is David Lynch. David is a supply chain lead at Biari.
Stephen, we're a commercial mathematics company,
yes.
which I'll probably dive a little bit more into in the presentation, just in terms of talking about use cases. But we solve problems that are industry problems, real problems, and we did mathematics and economics when I was at university. This was my favourite piece of that. I'll just jump back. Sorry, it likes to jump through there. This is operations research. So this is a discipline of mathematics. Basically relates to decision making. And helping make the right decisions using mathematics, which is kind of the whole thesis around Biari, the company that I work for. My background is very supply chain heavy, some stuff in agricultural supply chains, so a grain piece, which a couple of grain projects rather, but I'll touch on one of those later, but just across the supply chain. So lots of bulk supply chains, strategic import models. I've touched on things like vehicle routing, warehouse optimization, elements like that. So that's kind of my background, and how I got into this gig is kind of looking at the algorithms, and I think that it's pretty exciting, some of the stuff that that can be done with them. I'll jump to the next slide. Now, I'm aware that the title is a little I don't know, I'm reading it back now, I'm thinking it's a little esoteric. I just want to make sure that, I set expectations for what I'll be talking about. So we'll start with some broad stuff. We'll start with some classic high school debating style definitions of what we're talking about when we talk about algorithms, because it's a pretty broad thing to throw out there. We kind of alluded to in the blurb, I think, but algorithms are pretty pervasive. Now, with that context, then I'll look to zero in on the kind of algorithms that I'm interested in. So that's that operations research, optimization theory. It keeps jumping me ahead, apologies. That style of thing, we'll drill into that. And then finally, I'll look to take to, I guess, I'll look to take about 4 key takeaways, particularly focused on some of the case studies that I'll bring up. And I think those are takeaways that are fairly broad. Hopefully, you always walk the line. You don't want to be too broad to be useful, but equally, I think quite broad so that there's a meaningful takeaway from those, regardless of what field you're in trying to apply an algorithm or even a new technology. So we'll kind of get to that down the track. But first of all, the definitions that I alluded to, and I understand we're starting at a fairly high level here. So certainly looking at an algorithm, I think it's an appropriate thing. I mean, I probably wouldn't have come out with this exact definition if you'd asked me at the start without Googling it. And I'm technically doing a webinar on algorithms and how we can use them in our supply chains. A process or set of rules to be followed in calculations or other problem-solving operations. Back a slide, especially by a computer. So I think that's a key thing. I also really liked this definition down on the bottom right, which speaks to an ordered set of instructions. The bit I liked about this one was saying we're taking a data input and we're producing a data output. So I'll get onto that a little bit more, but I think a really key part of algorithms is I almost think of it like a promise, right? When it's not really, but I kind of think about it like a promise. You have a set of data that you give it. It can be a really simple set of data. It can be a really comprehensive set of data. And that algorithm, if it's built well, should theoretically be giving you a good output and should produce what you want it to produce. Cool. We'll just jump into some examples of algorithms here. I couldn't resist, sorry. I looked up forecasting because I wanted to speak about forecasting algorithms. This is the first Google image result, and it just looks like every cheesy presentation you'll ever see. So I couldn't resist putting it in the deck there. So this is a little bit around, and I understand there'll be people, academics who have a much deeper understanding of something like this than myself, but just trying to frame it out. So apologies to those in the room who for this is years and years ago of very rudimentary stuff. But this is what a forecasting algorithm might look like. So a forecasting algorithm being a type of algorithm, And in this example, I've said you can take 2 years of historical data in terms of sales by SKU and region. Go back. I should have fixed that setting before I started, so you'll have to bear with me. And your output of that algorithm could be, say, forecast sales by SKU and region for the next 3 months. So you have your key inputs and your outputs that kind of define at a functional level what your algorithm is doing for you. And in this case, we're at a very human level, you can look at that and say that's doing forecasting. It's a forecasting algorithm, which is kind of a subset of algorithms in terms of a functional subset. And also there I've highlighted it's predictive, and I'll get onto that a little bit, what I mean, and the different kinds of algorithms, and what I'm talking about when I say predictive versus say prescriptive. I put this example in because I saw it at a TSBE event. I think it was a couple of months ago out in Dolby. There was some really cool technologists basically putting computer vision into action. So this is a photograph. They were doing it on a video feed, I believe. And in essence, this is using computer vision, so a computer vision algorithm. And that's descriptive in nature. And again, I'll talk about what I mean by that later. But again, you've got input data, a very different kind of input data to the previous algorithm, stating the obvious, a kind of standard resolution image, and you would expect to receive kind of the elements which are what you're trying to get out of that algorithm. So the locations of the livestock and the livestock count in the image. Now, I understand that this is probably seeming very high level, and I guess I want to frame it out because I won't be talking about these two algorithms in particular. I'm going to dive into a more specific subset of algorithms in an area where I genuinely do feel like BRE have strong thought leadership, and we can give you a bit more insight into. Again, speaking of stock images that I hate these kind of generic, cheesy, PowerPoint graphs somewhat, but I do like the meaning behind this one. Speaks to, and it says analytics, but you could replace that with, it means analytics in broad terms, I think. So effectively, algorithms can be used to do all of these things, and often are. Now, we saw our predictive algorithm when we were looking at forecasting. We saw a descriptive algorithm, which is taking something and saying, yep, I can tell you what's going on there. The area that I'm most interested in is prescriptive analytics, or algorithms that are prescriptive in nature. So they're saying, subject to these circumstances in which you're operating, this situation that you have, whether it be your state of your supply chain, the amount of product you have in inventory, whatever else it is influencing your situation and what you think your situation will be into the future, the algorithm will then say, okay, this is the decision you should make. This is the best step you can take subject to your circumstances. So that's the particular area of I guess, algorithms that I'm interested in and the work we do in the supply chain team at BRE. I'll probably jump through these ones pretty quick. And I kind of spoke a little bit about this in a previous presentation, and I was talking about algorithmic logistics planning, which is a little bit what I'll talk about today. Logistics planning like this is most likely familiar to a number of people on the call. It's a pretty intensive exercise, and it's pretty critical for supply chain execution, being able to have planning processes. One thing that I've found working, kind of across industry, go back again, across industry, and across kind of lots of different segments is whole ecosystems spring up around these planning processes. These planning processes are mature. People form deep, highly valued careers off the back of these planning processes. The bit down the bottom there, I guess, they serve to link and synchronize the overall supply chain as a continuous process. But the point I would make is that these are mature processes and very experienced individuals who have a lot going on in their head when they're kind of making these very complex plans. And I guess the point that I made then and the point that I make now is obviously subject to the situation and the context. Once you get to a certain scale of trying to plan for the future, whatever it is you're planning for, when you get to a certain scale of planning, a computer is always going to perform better than a person. And that's, I don't know whether that's controversial or not to say. I suspect not, I hope not. but there's basically a point at which how many things can you keep in your head at once? Because even if it's 100, a computer can do better than that. So it's a very rudimentary way of saying it. But when I say algorithmic logistics planning, using algorithms to kind of come at these logistics problems, that's the perspective I'm coming at it from. The scaling complexity in these organizations with these complex national, global, but also complicated at a very facility level supply chains, it just blows out. And we see that in terms of the scale of the models that we end up building. So what I want to talk about now, and I guess this is kind of coming to the next part where I talk about use cases, and hopefully those use cases are meaningful and you can relate those to some situations you've seen in your business. I pulled up this basic framework in a previous presentation I gave, and I guess this is essentially a reflection of, I wonder if there's any people who've studied this actually in the room. You'll see it straight away, but this is basically a reflection of how you might formulate a model when you're looking at operations research. So from a mathematical perspective, this is almost a reflection of this. So you've got in that model, when you build a model, when you're doing algorithmic planning, you have decisions, and we call them variables in a mathematical context, but you have decisions, right, that you're planning. You know, should I transport this product from here to here? What volume should I transport? When should I make that? When should I blend these products together? So there's lots of different, I wouldn't think about this first element of the framework as the big decisions, lots of little small decisions that are important day to day, week to week, in terms of executing a plan for your business. The second piece here to this framework is rules. So we think about constraints in the world of mathematics, but these rules are governing what you're allowed to do and what you aren't allowed to do. So there's contracts in place which determine I have to supply this amount of product. The really obvious rules are the ones that relate to space. So I only have enough space to store 20,000 tons of this product. At the event in Toowoomba last week, the AgTech event, there was a really interesting point from I think it was Dan from Cane Growers, who said that they have a huge competitive advantage with the storage capacity at a port. So that's an example where you can say, okay, that's constrained. In their example, it's not very constrained. They've effectively removed that constraint. But they can be very obvious or very subtle rules, and it'll probably be quicker if I just dig into the case studies to go at that. And then the third piece of the framework, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and I've kind of highlighted there, I think it's pretty important, is the objectives. So how do you drive decision-making? Most often, these are framed as dollars and cents. So practically, when a client's looking at a problem like this, often they're saying, how can I look at the decisions that I make and the rules that apply to my business, take all of that, and either minimize cost or maximize profit. So that's the simplest way, and a way in which a lot of clients view it. But more and more, I'm finding, and I guess we're finding, that it's more nuanced than that. There's a little bit of other objectives in the mix that are important for long-term success of the business. Yeah, look, I've ripped through this really quickly, but hopefully this makes some sense, because I'll try to. I think if it's not entirely making sense at this point, it hopefully will when we go through these case studies and these examples. So I'm going to share a few case studies with you today. I think there's 3 case studies, and let me just find out what the first one of those is. Fantastic. So potentially relevant to some on the call, grain export problem. And I've worked on a number of projects in the grain supply chain. Certainly interesting to see the similarities and differences between organisations. One similarity I've seen is, and it's an obvious one, is the port is a huge bottleneck. And that's what I guess I was particularly interested in the comment from Cane Growers at the event last week. The port is often a huge bottleneck, and it drives cost up the rest of the operation, because the port is clearly you need your goods at the port to then export if you're largely servicing an export market. So I won't read everything on the screen there. A large exporter of grain with a huge storage facility at port. People who are familiar with, in particular, wheat will understand that among other factors, protein is critical in terms of the quality of the wheat that you're exporting, and therefore the corresponding price. So typically you're contracted to provide a certain grade of wheat. If you're giving additional protein above that level, for example, you're effectively giving away money at that point. So there's an interesting dynamic there. And I think the obvious thing, or not the obvious thing, the kind of critical piece, and probably why this was a challenge that was brought to a mathematics company like us, is the scale of the problem. So 240 individual storage locations within the facility. So lots of different ability to move, put different product in different, whether it's the silo or the annexes or other locations. And it got to the point where planning staff, who, as I alluded to before, highly adept, really, really skilled at this, but still struggling to manage movements within the port when the port was over 65% capacity, was the driver for that. So we looked at it and said, how can we frame this in a way in which we can basically prove it out as an algorithmic model? Now, I've got a little bit of, I'm not sure if we'll get much audience participation. I've been on a variety of webinars recently where there's been some great participation and some radio silence. But if anyone's feeling brave enough on this beautiful Monday to stick their hand up and say what they think some of the decisions might be, or some of the rules that apply to that port facility, or even the objective of the business when doing that, please stick your hand up and yell out. Stephen, is that something we can try to do?
Yeah, we can go with that. I know there's some people here from GRDC, there's people here from GrainCorp and various other organisations that this is very relevant to. So I guess if anyone wants to participate, they're welcome to. Otherwise, Dave will move along.
I'm going to push it and give everyone 20 seconds just in case someone's feeling brave today.
So all you need to do is put your hand up, and then I will give you permission to talk, and we go from there. Here we go. We've got Jillian. One moment. I'll give you permission to share. And you're away, Jillian.
Hi, Steph. Can you hear me?
Yep, gotcha.
I can. I'm going to have a slash at this, Dave, just because I love a bit of interaction in webinars, and it's not fun when you've got radio silence. When we're thinking about rules, and I guess this could apply to a producer on farm as much as at port, really basic things about the capacity of those silos, like is one 20 tonne and another 500 tonne, how easy it is to get out of the particular silos. If it's an annex, do you need a loader? If it's a silo, it's a simple conveyor. So one is preferenced over the other, basic things like that. And I guess from starting back at the beginning, where I should always start but never do, decisions, timing, that basic timing, when a ship's coming in, when is product coming in. That's would probably be the very first spot, I think, in decisions.
Yeah, fantastic.
Objectives is at the dollar, absolutely maximising everything so that best dollar.
Fantastic. I didn't flick that over to try and cut you off, Gillian. But those were really good answers, and thank you very much for putting your hand up. And I think you were right on a lot of it, right? So the fundamental decision is when are you moving product from where to where. That's kind of the generic high level one. You talked about when are you bringing product into the facility. Now that was not always a decision in this example, but in your best case, yeah, that is a decision that you'd be able to control when operating the facility, because clearly, if you don't have space for it, it's a pain in the ass if a train or a truck turns up. So those decisions, unloading the product from the train and the truck into the facility, consolidating product if you're choosing to do that to open up another silo, the decision of what products to blend to create the correct characteristic blend to meet a particular order, and then obviously the loading of the vessel. So when you're loading the vessel, and kind of how long that's having to stay at the berth based on how quickly you're filling it. Some decisions around fumigation, which obviously didn't refer to fumigation in the previous slide. Decisions around labour. So when you're having different shifts on, at times it makes sense to pull back on shifts if it's obviously not it's on the shoulder season or it's not kind of in the middle of the season. the rules. The storage capacity is a great one and should always be the most obvious one when we're talking about these bulk supply chains. There's other less obvious rules, which every person on the call will know, that you're not going to pour your barley in on top of wheat. Unfortunately, that an algorithm that you build doesn't necessarily know that, so you have to codify all of those rules that say, right, you're not going to mix those products together. You're not going to do that. I'll skip through a little bit, but the relationship type rules that say, okay, I have to have these shifts on in different parts of the facility to be running those parts of the facility. Gillian, I really liked your comment about the different ways. Is that feeding a silo? Is it a flat bottom where you're going to have a lower throughput? So those rules kind of around the impact on throughput of different types of storage or different types of plant are there. And then the objective, their objective was minimizing cost. Yeah, it's all about the dollar. I mean, the piece that I'll probably get onto is one that I reflect on a lot, which is, when should the objective not always just be about the dollar? And I think this is one of those examples where you talk about, if I was to look at this again, and I don't think it was particularly, an issue in this case, but in similar cases, I'd say, right, we need some kind of combination objective that also has a strong bent towards the resilience of that port, because unexpected events happen, and you need to be able to have those resilience metrics that you're also setting as your objective. Fantastic. Really appreciate the participation, Gillian. That was great. This is just a little bit about the outcome, and I guess I put this in there because this is how we speak about case studies. What was the challenge and what we're able to deliver? The obvious one is around savings, but to me, kind of, and probably almost the value proposition for that organisation was particularly strongly geared to actually the first dot point, which is around the speed of replanning. So the idea of being able to take into account lots of different rapidly updating data points and then produce a new plan quickly, rather than having to spend a couple of hours thinking about how all the flow-on effects of changes affect the rest of the system, is clearly a value proposition in these organisations where time is money, obviously, and being able to react quickly is a unique advantage. Jump on through. Now, this one is I might be stretching the friendship on whether this is strictly AgTech at this point. I brought it up because some of the hardest parts around grocery warehousing relate to the constraints associated with produce, which are obviously constraints that around timings and refrigeration and everything like that potential attendees of this call might see in their business as well. So again, I won't read it all out, but essentially one of Australia's largest grocers, and this one might hit too close to home, but it's also a labour scheduling problem. So lots of different employees, lots of different skill sets, qualifications, availabilities, productivities, and the required hours of work. While it might be obvious to say, oh, we'll just get these fixed shifts on and get everyone to turn up, the hours of work are highly dependent on when you do one task that must go after another, that must go after another. And then there's also the ability to move certain elements of the work to different points in the day, which can be cost effective in relation to a particular EBA that's relevant here, the complex EBAs that they have across their sites. I think other key I'm kind of giving away one of the ones to the next slide, but another key constraint was on staging space. So there's a limited amount of staging space in the inbound and the outbound, and a limited number of equipments as well. And I guess I'll highlight also, obviously, like everyone, the difficulty retaining the labour force that's required to operate the distribution centre. So they're basically saying, how do we roster people and schedule that labour in the most effective way to get all our product into the DC, do everything we need to do, get it out of the DC. And I'll jump through the next slide, and I will give you guys a chance it can be Gillian again, but also it can be anyone, to say, looking at this problem of labour scheduling and product flow within a distribution centre, does anyone want to put their hand up and say what they think the decisions, the rules, or the objectives might be for this one? No interest, Steve?
No interest there for this one.
That's fair enough. I think the other one's more interesting anyway. So I'll jump on through and I'll see if you guys agree with me on what the decisions, rules and objectives are. So,
we did have one comment in the Q&A, timing of orders. Thanks, Jacko.
yeah, that's a really good point. The timing of orders in terms of when those orders are being dispatched from the distribution centre was a core rule. And I guess it's relevant to say it was one of those, getting a little bit deep in the weeds here, but it was a rule and yet it was also an objective. So we were saying, you really, you don't want to run late on this. We call them soft rules. So basically the model is really inclined to not run late on this, and it's going to incur significant penalty if it's running late on this. But yeah, typically you would look at that timing of orders as a rule. I'm looking at the decision column, and I worked on this particular system for a number of years. It seems overly simple, and keep in mind that behind the scenes, there's probably lots of other mini decisions that are factoring into this, and factoring into the model. But the basic decisions are which employees to assign to what shifts and what tasks within those shifts, and when to process different products at different stages in the intra-warehouse chain. So the idea that this facility becomes so complex, within itself, that you need to understand, when am I moving and processing different elements from here to here, thus enabling me to do this piece of work? Or can I do this piece of work early, and then that enables this later piece of work to be done at a different time? The rules they're kind of doubly complex, because you're talking about a problem where you're solving labour scheduling and also flow of product at the same time, which makes it interesting, but there's a degree of complexity. So again, I've summarised, and if anyone's particularly interested in any of these, please yell out after. I'm happy to go deeper. But you talk about those typical rules you see in scheduling and rostering. So your maximum hours for a given period, or maybe minimum. Maybe there's a minimum set of hours in a particular EBA for a period that you need to adhere to. Restrictions based on qualification and availability are other elements. The EBA, I've kind of alluded to those group of EBA rules, because there's just a lot of EBA rules that anyone who's touched rostering and scheduling of people before will understand that there's a lot of rules involved. Other rules, we had capacity last time. Now we've got a little bit different capacity. This is capacity in terms of pallets, basically, rather than capacity in terms of tons. Your equipment capacities, your timings, which I think Jacko talked about, the timings to meet those store orders, absolutely a critical rule. And the break rules, which is again back to the EBA and back to the shift. Now, I'm conscious of time again, but interestingly, if you just ignore that first point, because is that basically a soft rule at the top there, your objectives are absolutely to minimise the total cost of the roster. So standard rates, loadings, OT rates, incentive payments. I've never seen anything as complicated as the different ways that people can get paid working in some of these different distribution centres. But there's this other, and an objective that they genuinely cared about and wanted to trade off against cost at times was the best task rotation and other factors of a roster, but basically different factors that were positive in terms of employee safety and employee satisfaction. So saying, I know that this is going to cost me, potentially going to cost me some amount in terms of my optimized plan, but I'm comfortable making that decision because these are the different things that I've identified and will make my employees more sticky and more likely to continue to work in the business. So there's a case for objectives that aren't cost, where there's things that you can't quite, they're going to cost the business down the track if you lose that employee. So you need some way to bring that back up into this objective and say, hey, don't work everyone to the bone. We need to trade this off and make sure that you pass this to an algorithm and you tell an algorithm to minimize cost. It's just going to minimize cost. So it's not like a human looking at it with that nuance to say, oh, but I won't do that in this case. So you need to pass all that information in and certainly identify those cases where there's something external that it has a long-term cost associated with it. Again, I won't spend too much time on this one, but labour planning is interesting and kind of like the previous example, the idea of being able to replan, but also have a clear planning process standardised. There's that reduction of personnel risk. I often see planning managers who just can't go on a holiday because they have all this knowledge in their head that's not systemized, codified, and fed into an algorithm. So it's a really hard situation for those operators who are very talented. And you see organizations who think, wow, there's a real personnel risk because if that individual goes, we're going to struggle for a little bit.
There's some pretty clear return on investment there, 3 to 6% for that supermarket to have brought BR in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was really good. And obviously that's the headline number and it's the one you usually shout about. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is there's these kind of, other nuances that I feel like end up being just as important for the business. I mean, might not get presented to the executive, but for the people on the ground at the distribution centre, the most exciting thing for them is some of these other less tangible elements.
Yeah, but I guess to get the work underway, they want to know what, pretty much up front before they invest in this technology is that they're going to see return on investment at the other end.
So, spot on, Stephen. There's usually a process that we go through, which I won't go into too much, but we prove the concept out typically first and say, hey, this is the expectation purely from a maths perspective. Can all of these rules be codified? Because sometimes, we haven't even talked about this, but sometimes rules can't be codified in the way that you meaningfully want them to be, or you don't have the data required to codify those rules. So there's a whole bunch of situations where it doesn't make sense to take this approach. I might touch a little bit maybe on that data stuff as well in the takeaways. Now, I'm just conscious, so we're 40 minutes in, aren't we, Stephen? There's this use case, which is around returnable crates. And I'm just thinking, I might...
Just keep going. I'll pull you up if we're getting close, mate.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, good. Thanks, Stephen. Fantastic. So I'm even wondering whether some people on this call have been at the other end of this supply chain that I'm going to talk about now, which is around returnable crates, both for protein and for produce. So the idea being that the produce and the protein get packed into these crates, sent off to the supermarket, put on the shelf and bought, and the crates have to be cleaned functionally. And this is where this particular element comes in. It's one of these weird, like circular supply chain type situations, like people who are always looking at pallets or containers. This is kind of the bespoke produce version of that circular supply chain. Now, the organisation we worked with provided the crate washing and also managed the rebalancing of crates via transport to the different facilities that they run. So I think there was 5 or 6 facilities up the East Coast, along with 13 different SKUs. So functionally 13 different types of crates. Now, some of them were the same, but some of them were, this one is specifically washed in a way that it can store protein and it's adhering to these kind of restrictions. It was a very manual planning process in terms of looking at that critical asset. And I've said there, the throughput was constrained by the critical asset, which is the washing facilities. And a unique situation where you've got shifting supply and demand, you've got that strictly limited throughput associated with the washing facility. And then when you're changing over the washing facility from crate type A to crate type B, there's going to be an overhead associated with switching around the machinery, even if it's a small overhead. For an organisation that's running very close to the limit in terms of getting all the demand out, losing that time is clearly critical as well. So we had to look at how we could plan this in an algorithmic way to reduce that planning time and to think about all those different constraints and those different rules. Dare I try again and see if anyone is a produce crate aficionado? I'm also interested if anyone at the more grower side of the scale has experience with these crates. I know there's sometimes supply chain challenges getting them out there.
Dave, it's Gillian again. I've just got a question, and it relates somewhat to this one as well. When you're factoring in an organisation's policy in terms of whether they've got a just-in-time or just-in-case understanding, do you factor it in at this point where it's a rule, or does it get put into the algorithm in another manner? How do you treat those policies?
Yeah, I think those kind of policies, I mean, one is, the answer is essentially you would typically take it into account as either a rule or an objective. So whether that's it's a rule as in we do this all the time, or it's kind of an objective in we do this most of the time, but you can allow the exceptions if there's this really big cost imperative. What we find with kind of those different policies is those are really good ones to say, you can build an algorithm that adheres to one policy, and then say, we're going to remove that constraint. We're going to remove that restriction. And often we make that available, the kind of deep editing in the application that we would deploy to them, and say, okay, if I remove this constraint, what's the impact in terms of cost? So if I'm going to change my model, or I'm going to, it may not be removing it entirely, but if I'm going to make a shift in the way that I do business there, we see that as a valuable use case to say, people often do a bit of serviette maths and say, if we change from this policy to this policy, yeah, we think there's a bit more risk, but I think you're going to save $10 million over the year, or whatever it is. Something powerful with these algorithms and these models is being able to say, let's genuinely change the way we're operating in terms of the rules the system operates by, and then see what the difference in cost is, or the difference in profit is.
Thank you. That helps. It then becomes a decision-making tool with where you can have a risk-based assessment within it, which would inform, bigger policies or models, if you like.
Exactly. And the risk-based assessment is a really good call out, because it's one that we don't do the same way every time. Sometimes there's almost like a heuristic level, a rudimentary risk management approach at the objective level. Sometimes you're going deeper than that with the simulation layer. So it is a little bit dependent on the degree of variability and risk in the organization. But in these models, clearly, I think a really good example, which I haven't put in this deck, but we've done some work with shipping companies over in Europe, and they've always struggled to adopt algorithmic approaches. And what we found is the reason they were struggling to adopt algorithmic approaches was they were very much not in the core algorithm considering those risk elements. So it was all about, my colleague called Rav, who I no longer work with, always put it as playing chess rather than poker. So these algorithms that are saying, yes, if you slot everything exactly like that and everything will happen as we expect it to, and therefore this is the perfect way to do it, as opposed to saying, let's produce a result from the algorithm that is resilient to potential unexpected events, and is going to give us the kind of best worst case rather than the exact case we think is going to happen. I'm glad you brought that.
That's really helpful. Sorry for hijacking your case study there.
No, you're good. I certainly appreciate the audience participation. Unless anyone else has their hand up, and please start talking if you do, I'm just going to jump through. So these are some of the ones we've seen before. We've talked about throughput capacity. We've seen storage capacity. Clearly, if you're looking at supply chains where you've got product, there's a rare case where you've got all the storage capacity in the world and you don't even need to consider it as a constraint. That is definitely the less common case. There's the requirements for cleaning and associated timings between the different crates that you're processing, changeover timings. Again, we see labor coming up, and I think it's come up in all three case studies, even though it's in two of them wasn't the core of the algorithm. The idea that these shift capacities, in terms of the capacity for a shift to provide a certain amount of required labor, is critically important to operating and kind of understanding how much you can flow through the particular facility. The decisions here are kind of, I've put the shifts in there, but the kind of underlying and core decisions are twofold. So what crates are being processed at what time, how many of those am I running through before I change over to a different crate, and then also transport decisions. When should clean or dirty crates be transferred to different facilities? So that whole, okay, I'm going to move it between a facility, or I'm going to wait until, I'm not sure whether I'm going to have that demand at the facility such that I'll need to. And then fundamentally, there's not any fancy objectives here. This organisation were looking at minimising the cost of operating as their major objective. So these are kind of looking at the big picture around how we've applied some of these algorithms to supply chains, both in the ag sector and outside of it. Kind of the takeaways that I'd given, and these are hopefully high level at if you're operating in an organisation and thinking, what do I need to think about if I want to apply some of these approaches? These are the ones that I'd recommend. So the first one just going to jump through it. It's going to steal my thunder on all of these probably, but I think you need to know the problem you're solving and why it's worth solving. So this comes back to that objective. You know, are you solving a problem around reducing planning overhead or de-risking that planning area? Or are you solving a problem because you know that there's cost there that you can squeeze out of the business? Why is the problem worth solving? And I guess I've made my talk about the tech, I've made my talk about algorithms, but I think, you know, I was thinking about this because I actually heard someone present a couple of weeks ago at a function in Sydney on blockchain. And I think I'm not having a blockchain or anyone in the room who works in it, but I think blockchain is the quintessential example of something that people can be tech first rather than problem first about. I think the same point goes for these algorithms and lots of different technologies. They might be exciting, but you need to understand what problem you're solving and why it's even worth solving. You might be like, oh, this is a problem, but like, what's the payoff if you can actually solve it? I think that's important to understand.
That's very much around, I guess, the key message we're sending out from the AgTech and Logistics Hub and from last week's event that you mentioned before, 400M. It's all about, you know, what are the challenges for industry? And let's then go and identify if there's existing tech and good tech that can solve that problem. And yeah, it's not until you've identified what the challenge or problem is before you go looking at what tech is out there. So whether it's AI or whether it's what we're talking about here or whether it's robotics or something else, you know, it's let's identify the challenge first and then go looking for the tech. Now that tech might already exist, or it might be something that we have to collaborate around to bring tech to that problem.
Yeah, and look, this is probably easier for some than others as well. I think it's a really good point you make, Stephen. I had an old lecturer who loved this stuff more than I do, and you know, he would always talk about he's got a hammer and everything looks like a nail. But I think but certainly finding these problems and saying, yeah, I want to solve that is the first step.
Yeah, it's a favourite of mine.
Yeah, identifying the best situation to use these algorithms, and I mean specifically these prescriptive decision support algorithms, is a specific skill set. And the reason I was thinking about this a little bit was, again, stealing my thunder, but when I was talking about the produce crates, the individual in that organisation who came to us with a problem around, hey, how can we plan the produce crates better? Coincidentally, was a person with a maths degree, right? So this person has an understanding of the technology, he knows what it can apply to, and he's got this skill set where he can identify the situations to use it. So I'm certainly not suggesting that everyone needs to go down to your local uni and go get a maths degree or a degree in something relevant. I think it's more about, I mean, basically educating yourself. So I think one area where individuals get a lot of ability to do that is just experience. So looking at a project where, you know, an algorithm is applied, being deep in that project, individuals within businesses then get a deeper understanding of, okay, what are the different cases in my business that we aren't doing right now in a way that's smart. We're doing it in a way that's very manual and we're getting by. I was thinking I need to say something here about the best way to gain that skill set. No, I'm not sure I entirely know what the best way is to gain that skill set. I think I'm curious to hear what other people think about that as well, but I think it's clearly a key skill set. And I almost want to make the point that it's a skill set that I think is just as important as being able to solve the problem with an algorithm in the first place. Because if you don't have people in your organization who can identify these use cases for applying a technique like this, then it's never going to end up happening. So I think it's a pretty critical skill set. We talked about the objective a bit, and you know, I wanted to go a little bit deeper into this and when cost is the right and the wrong objective to focus on. I think in my experience that it always looks like the easiest thing to define, right? You're just like, yeah, just add up all my costs and find the option that gives me the lowest cost. But I think genuinely it takes a deeper look than that. It's around the idea of saying, right, this is the cost of my plan, yes, but what's going to be my cost of execution? What's going to be my cost when things change or when unexpected events occur? And more than that, you're often planning for a period of weeks or months. what's the cost implication of the way that I'm planning for the next multiple years in my business? So to me, maybe it just gets a bit challenging because it just looks so simple up front, but looking at, okay, what does a good result look like? What does a good plan look like? Which is essentially what your objective is saying, is quite critical. And I've just got one last one. We didn't really touch on data much. And I guess there's 2 points to this. These algorithms, clearly, if you don't have any data that's relevant, you don't know your storage capacities, or you don't know your up-to-date demand or your up-to-date supply of goods, you're not going to be able to solve some of these problems that you want to solve. But something we also find is you don't know the quality of your data until you try to use it in a meaningful way. And when I say a meaningful way, there's a spectrum of that. Obviously, say you start graphing something, you're graphing different results, you're starting to use your data in a meaningful way. But I find once you're using your data and trying to use it to create, feed into an algorithm like this and produce a genuine result that you're going to use to drive decision-making in your business, that's when it then ends up being, you're never going to know what's going on with your data until you put yourself in a situation where the results of using that data are meaningful. So I guess it's a bit of a double-edged sword around everyone is going to walk in here. I'm not going to blow anyone's mind by saying you need to have quite good data. But I think there's the other side to it where, organizations that undertake work like this, I think, have a degree of acceleration on that data maturity curve because they're more quickly able to identify what's good, what's missing, and go from there. I think we're okay for time, but that's me for the day. I think my challenge for the day was going to be around, looking at different pieces that are maybe manual processes in your organization and saying, maybe not the straight away, how can I solve this, but maybe what would the decisions or the rules or the objectives be if I was to look at that approach. So I guess I'd challenge everyone on the call to, see if they can identify something in their organization and say, hey, how can we look at that if it's a manual process, and say, how do we codify those decisions and those rules in particular?
Opportunity. David, is there anything else that, are there any other examples where you've applied, I guess, more closely around the farmer? I think last week we saw examples of some AI, not necessarily algorithmic supply chain planning as such, but AI in use in Go Micro. I think there was another solution there with Zondi and a few other solutions out there. Is there anything that is more boots on the ground from out in the paddock where you can see algorithmic planning taking place?
Yeah, the hard bit is, I guess, the piece where when you look at these problems, you always need to not just look at the decisions, but also look at the decisions that are within your control. Because if you try to apply an algorithm and it says, make this decision, you're like, hang on a minute, I don't actually control those steps up the supply chain. And I get that there's a real thing just anyway at a broad perspective there that kind of growers deal with. There's not a specific use case that I can think of there. Certainly the technologies you mentioned are fantastic. Some other work that another team at BRE work on around forecasting and prediction is kind of, has some use cases, which I can send through perhaps, but I wish I knew more about what that team did. But basically the whole forecasting and prediction piece I see as being hugely valuable at that grower level. And then obviously those more specific technologies you highlighted as well.
Sure. So without further ado, thank you very much once again, Dave, for your presentation. We do have one question before we get going. It's not a question, it's a statement. Thanks, Dave, from Gillian Mapham and Jacko. Thank you very much for everyone that attended, and we'll see you next time.